everyone, welcome to the Fuel the Fight podcast. We have another great episode today. Another episode, as you can see, we're doing via Teams while doing some stuff to the studio. But another great guest from up north, outside the Boston area in Natick, Massachusetts. This time, Dr. Gaffney Stomberg talked about her colleagues over at the U.S. Army Research Institute Environmental Medicine. Well, we're going to talk to one of them today. We have Dr. Karl of the Military Nutrition Division at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine, also known as USAREM. We'll probably refer to that from here on out. But Dr. Karl is, one of the Department of Defense leading researchers in the gut microbiome. Some of you might be listening to this or watching this and want to know, what is the gut microbiome? You're going to learn today. If you already know, you're still going to learn some stuff. But without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Karl to the podcast. How you doing, Phil?
Great, Colonel Behringer. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to sharing with all the listeners what we know about the gut microbiome, especially in relation to nutrition and military performance. Thank you for having me on.
No, it was my pleasure to have you on, and I'm excited for this talk, if you can't tell. One of the things that I always like to start off with is, dietitians. I think it's a very unique profession. And I hear just so many different stories of how people become dietitians. So I want to ask you, Phil, what got you to become a dietitian? How did you become a dietitian, and why did you become a dietitian?
Well, I guess there's a few reasons. I think the main reason I always give people is because I love to eat. I just like food, so figured out you might as well do something that I love. But I guess, back in the day, and the day being, late high school, early college, I really got into sports nutrition. I was an athlete in high school and college. Not a very good athlete, but I like to call myself an athlete during that time. And I started to realize how important nutrition was to optimal athletic performance. And I started off college as actually an engineering major. Took some engineering classes, did that for a few years, and was really bored. I was like, I can't do this the rest of my life. So I figured, why not do something that I'm personally interested in, that I know I'll enjoy doing, and that led me to the nutrition school at Ohio State, where I did my undergrad, and I really enjoyed the classes I started taking. I'll never forget my first class. It was a food lab. We were making like meatloaf and desserts. I'm like, all right, I can get on board with this, understanding the food chemistry of what goes on in cooking. And I said, yeah, this is what I want to do. Nutrition's interesting to me. I can apply it to my everyday life. And I think I'll enjoy doing this for the rest of my career. So I just enrolled in the dietetics program. And ever since, I've been fascinated with learning nutrition. And I learn new stuff every day, including about the gut microbiome, which is, what I do now.
No, that's awesome. And for the listeners out there, Phil's a better athlete. He's downplaying it. He was a collegiate rower, I believe. So, pretty good athlete there, pretty high level. But you mentioned the gut microbiome. And so let's start very basic for the folks here. What is the gut microbiome, and really, why should the warfighter even care about the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so simply put, the gut microbiome is a collection of microorganisms. So microorganisms being things like bacteria, yeast, and fungi that live inside our gastrointestinal tract. And people may or may not know that we actually have thousands and trillions of these microorganisms living inside of us. And that seems kind of scary until you think about it and you realize that these microorganisms are there because they're carrying out functions that our bodies really cannot. And most of those functions are beneficial to our bodies. So these microbes have co-evolved with us. They live with us. We provide an environment for them to live in. And they, in turn, produce a variety of vitamins, other compounds that have largely beneficial effects on our body. So when we're thinking about why this community of microorganisms is important for the warfighters, because they're carrying out functions that our body cannot. They're improving our immune function. They're potentially interacting with our brain and influencing how we think and how we feel. They're providing compounds that our bodies can use for energy, which may help us perform physically. They're doing just all these things that our bodies can't do on their own. They're helping us just be better and healthier.
Nice. So, you know, with that, so we have this thing going on. It's keeping us healthy. It's keeping us in the fight. Um, what what causes changes to the gut microbiome? What might change it so it either, you know, keeps us healthy or doesn't keep us healthy or gets us sick?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like to think about the gut microbiome, the community, as kind of a balance. So oftentimes that balance is skewed towards, benefiting health, but it's very true that that balance can be skewed in the other direction to a state that we call dysbiosis, which is kind of an unhealthy state in the gut microbiota that could be linked to unwanted health effects. And things that can cause those kind of changes are things like psychological stress, environmental stress, and eating poor diets in particular can skew that community in a way that favors unhealthy outcomes. However, what's exciting for me as a dietitian, one that works with military nutrition, is that we know that what we eat is one of the main factors influencing that community of microbes living inside of us. And we know that there's certain nutrients in the diet, things that we find in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, everything that everybody tells you to eat all the time, but nobody likes to eat. There's nutrients in those foods that feed the healthy microbes living in us. And we think that if we can eat enough of those foods, we can target those healthy, beneficial microbes in a way that skews that balance in a way that benefits health. So we can combat maybe the negative effects of stress or environmental extremes when we're thinking about military personnel by using dietary interventions that target beneficial microbes and skew the balance back in favor of a health promoting microbial community.
Gotcha. So, you know, we know what kind of causes the changes, and then the results of those changes can get people, sick, and then even nutrition. Um, what type of things that we eat, outside of vegetables and stuff might skew it one way or another?
Yeah, so we'll start with things that may skew the balance in an unfavorable way. So we know that high saturated fat intakes can have a negative effect on the microbiota. High sugar intakes, very highly processed foods that don't have a lot of fiber in them. Kind of the fast food type of things, all the foods that you're told not to eat, but they taste so good. Those foods taste good to the unhealthy microbes too, and they deprive the healthy microbes of the nutrients we should be feeding them. So eating foods like that, fast foods that don't have a lot of fruits, vegetables, a lot of fiber, that are high in fat, high in sugar, that does not lend itself to promoting a healthy microbiome. On the other hand, the way to really promote healthy microbes is, one, by consuming high amounts of dietary fiber. So for anybody that doesn't know, fiber is a carbohydrate source in our diet that our bodies can't digest. And this is the perfect example of our gut microbes doing something that our body cannot. By definition, our bodies cannot digest dietary fiber. However, the microbes that live inside of us can, and they do this, and they break it down into a substrate that our bodies can absorb, and they produce different compounds when they're metabolizing these carbohydrates that have beneficial health effects, and the fiber in turn promotes the growth of beneficial microbes. So eating high dietary fiber is the best way to improve the community composition of your gut microbiota. And we find fiber in things like whole grains, and cereals, fruits, and vegetables. Other things that promote the growth of healthy microbes are what we call phytonutrients, and particularly polyphenols. So these are compounds that give plant foods their color. So when you think about all the variety of colors that you see in fruits and vegetables, a lot of that color comes from polyphenols. And this is another example of microbes helping us digest foods that we cannot. Many of the polyphenols we consume in our diet are not absorbed in our small intestine. We are not equipped to do that. However, the microbes living inside of us transform the polyphenols in a way that allows our body to absorb them. And these transformed polyphenols have a variety of health benefits, to include promoting the production of beneficial microbes, but also The compounds have reduced inflammation, they reduce oxidative stress, they have a variety of beneficial health effects all over the body.
Nice. And so you talked about, fast food and some of the tasty, convenient foods that can have a negative effect on the gut microbiome. Now I'm going to ask the $1 million question that every soldier listening to this wants to know because, we talked to combat feeding a little bit about the famous MRE, the meals ready to eat. What or how does the MRE impact the gut microbiome? You're probably the one person on the planet who can speak to this.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked because we actually did a research study here at Usarium to answer that exact question. So we fed people nothing but a meal ready to eat diet for 3 weeks. Everybody wanted to sign up for that study.
I bet they were beating down the doors.
Yeah, it's an interesting study to recruit for. But we got it done. We had 3 people, or not 3 people. We had 30 people that consumed nothing but the meal ready to eat diet for 21 days. And then we had another group of 30 people that just ate their usual diet for 21 days. And the main question we were asking in that study is, what does eating the MRE diet do to a person's gut microbiota? And what we found was a little bit surprising to me because we really didn't see a whole lot. So the microbial community members that were altered by the MRE diet, most of them are microbes that you find in fermented food products. So if you think about things like yogurt, maybe some other fermented dairy products like kefir, you'll find fermented foods in like traditional sauerkraut and things like that. Kimchi is another example. These fermented foods contain specific microbes in there that start to break down the food. And what we found is that in people eating the MREs, they had a lowering of the amounts of those types of bacteria, which isn't surprising because the MREs do not have fermented foods in them. So when you take somebody who's eating their normal diet, maybe with some yogurt, getting these microbes that are in fermented foods, and you take that food away and you give them the MRE, then they experience a decrease in those microbes within the community. But other than that, we didn't really see a whole lot. We saw a couple changes in a few types of bacteria that I would characterize as kind of neutral. We don't think they're good. We don't think they're bad. But one of the things that we also looked at in that study was what we like to call intestinal permeability, or many people have heard of this concept as gut leakiness. So we had done some previous work in other environments where we had military personnel and training going through high physical activity, eating MREs, but also experiencing a lot of other stressors, cold, high altitude, and a lot of physical activity. And what we saw in those studies was an increase in gut leakiness in those individuals, that we were able to draw some connections to the composition of those people's microbiomes, gut microbiomes, suggesting that there's a connection, and we know there is a connection between the microbial community in our gastrointestinal tracts and this concept of gut leakiness. So we were interested in understanding whether or not the MRE diet, by virtue of its interaction with the gut microbiota, was causing this increase in gut leakiness that we see in these more austere environments that are common in military training. And what we actually found is that our measure of gut leakiness actually decreased in individuals eating an MRE diet, so a beneficial effect. So what we took out of that entire study is that the overall effect of the MRE diet on the microbial community within us and intestinal function, gut leakiness, is really kind of neutral. We're not having a harm. So that's exciting for us, because one of the things that we do, and you probably learned this in the last episode talking to Dr. Gaffney Stomberg, is we're always trying to improve the MRE. So when it comes to the microbiota and the gut microbiota, I think we've established a baseline, and we've shown that there's no harm to the microbiota that we can detect using our current methods with the current MRE platform. However, there's still ways to make it better, and we're exploring those different ways to make it better, continually improve the MRE now by trying to include nutrients that may target those healthy microbes living within us.
No, that's awesome. And so yeah, just to clarify, that is, the MRE does not cause gut leakiness.
Right.
I think this is going to be a big deal to a lot of soldiers listening to this. Kind of like I had Dr. Gaffney Stromberg. She busted the myth that the gum was a laxative. So these are kind of the big things. Gum's not a laxative, and
Nope.
now you heard it from the expert himself, Dr. Phil Karl. The MRE does not promote gut leakiness. So I think that's great because as I told her, I'm a big fan of the MRE. I think sometimes it gets a bad rap. It's really an awesome product.
Yep.
Well, kind of switching gears a little bit, but you're talking about all this good bacteria. Well, then should warfighters be taking probiotics? Should we just consume the good bacteria to get more of it in our gut? If so, what should we take?
Yeah, another great question. So for anyone that doesn't know, probiotics are live microorganisms often found in either fermented foods or dietary supplements that if you eat them in adequate amounts, they have a health benefit. So there's a couple things to think about when we're thinking about probiotics. One is that in order to be truly considered a probiotic, there has to be scientific evidence that the type of bacteria that you're consuming in the fermented food or the dietary supplement has a health benefit. And that's kind of a high bar to achieve. And there's a lot of products available on the commercial market that are labeled as probiotics that really don't meet the scientific definition of probiotics. So my first recommendation first thing I always tell people when they start thinking about probiotics is buyer beware. You really have to pay attention to what you're buying and kind of do some background work to understand if what you're buying really has any scientific evidence behind that. And I say that because not all probiotics or products marketed as probiotics are going to have the same health benefits. So we like to, in the scientific community, we say that the health effects of probiotics are strain specific. So when you think about bacteria, you have different ways of classifying bacteria from very precise ways, that's a species or a strain, to very general ways. And when we're talking about the effects of probiotics, the health benefits are often seen at the strain level. So a very specific type of bacteria will have very specific functions, and closely related bacteria may not have those same functions and may not confer the same health benefits. So that's why it's really important to do the research to understand what health benefit you're trying to gain from the probiotic, and then two, whether or not there's any evidence that that probiotic actually has the health benefit that it's being marketed for. There is evidence that certain probiotics may have beneficial effects on reducing things like infections, like respiratory tract infections, maybe gastrointestinal tract infections. There's some evidence that certain types of probiotics may help recovery from things like antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And there's other emerging evidence suggesting that certain probiotics may even help with our cognition and our mood and our psychological state. That's very preliminary evidence, and there's not a whole lot of evidence in humans right now, but there is a lot of work in the area. So I think in the future, and we're doing some of this work as well, there's going to be a scientific evidence base supporting certain probiotics for managing things like mood or stress. There's also even a younger field looking at probiotics for improving physical performance. We're in very early stages of that work, but there's evidence in animals that the concept may hold true, that we might be able to eat certain microorganisms that promote physical endurance. So we're trying to do some of that work as well, but we're a long way from there. So if anybody is thinking about using a probiotic, what I would encourage them to do for getting the information and understanding what a probiotic is not, and what products have scientific evidence behind them. The International Society for Probiotics and Prebiotics Research has a wonderful website that provides consumer information, professional information about what all these different biotic types are, including probiotics, and where you can begin to understand what probiotic may suit your particular health need that you're interested in addressing.
No, thanks for that, and I'll share it in kind of the show notes there for people. I'll get that link. Um, so we talked a little bit about probiotics. Um, you've done obviously the MRE study is a very cool study, but you've been looking at this for quite some time in different environments. Would you be willing to share kind of your most interesting microbiome study you've ever done?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting one to me that I've done personally, I think was really the first one we did here at the Usarium, in which we teamed up with the Norwegian Defense Forces, and we followed a group of Norwegian soldiers that were going out on a 4-day cross-country ski march. And this cross-country ski march, it was not atypical of a lot of military trainings, other than it was really cold. But it was characterized by a lot of physical activity, not a lot of sleep, changing diets from usual diets to a military ration diet, psychological stress of having to complete the course. So it wasn't an atypical environment where we have a lot of different stressors that we know can have negative effects on the microbiota. And what we saw in that environment was, and what I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, is that we saw a big shift in gut microbiota composition in this environment and an increase in gut leakiness, and we were able to see connections between the two. So that really opened my eyes to say that certain military stressors, especially when they're experienced in combination, which they often are in military personnel, can have unwanted effects on this microbial community inside of us, and that can result in changes, or appear to result in changes in how we behave physiologically, gut leakiness, for example, and that could in turn impact performance in military personnel in training or in combat. So that study was eye-opening. It provided evidence and rationale for doing more research in the area. And ever since then, we've really been trying to figure out how we can best make the microbiota resilient and leverage the microbiota in a way that actually promotes health and performance in these austere military environments that we tend to study and military personnel have to operate in.
Nice. So we know the environment kind of impacts it. Are there any kind of misconceptions or ideas about the gut microbiome that you hear folks talk about that as an expert you think they're missing the mark, or you want to clear the air right now to let folks know?
Well, I guess there's two things that come to mind. The first is that for people who maybe aren't so familiar with gut microbiome, they think about, all right, bacteria or microorganisms living in the gut. They're probably only relevant to gut health, and that's not true. We know that the community does have an impact on our gastrointestinal health, but we also know that the activities that they're doing influence organ systems throughout the body. And they do this by modulating the immune system, by producing molecules that get into our bloodstream and go to our brain, go to our muscle, go to our fat tissue. So in this way, the microbes living in our gastrointestinal tract aren't just influencing our gastrointestinal function, they're influencing function of organ systems throughout the entire body. So that's one misconception. I think on the other side of things are the people who believe that the microbiome is a cure-all or a silver bullet for everything. So I like to think of it. So as much as I hate to admit it, I think that South Park, the animated comedy show, actually did a really good piece on the gut microbiome a couple years ago, and it highlighted some of the ridiculousness that is kind of currently in the field and how people think about the microbiome. And for anyone who hasn't seen the episode, the idea was doing a microbiota transplant using a stool sample from Tom Brady. There is evidence that microbiota transplants can be beneficial for some gastrointestinal diseases, and it is true that if you take mice that don't have a microbiota because they've been raised in sterile conditions, you can take the microbiota from an individual with obesity or some other diseases and transfer that phenotype, so the obese state or the disease, to the mouse just by transferring the microbiota. I think it's very early stages of that research. So to think that we could take the stool sample from one person, an elite athlete, and just give it to someone else, and that person will become an elite athlete. It's not realistic. And I think some people have that perception, or that the field is going that way. We're not there yet. Maybe someday, way off in the future. I doubt it. But I think people's expectations need to be tempered somewhat, and not get too out of hand.
It's good you put that out there, because we don't want people like waiting outside of Tom Brady's bathroom. I could see,
Right.
for that. But even with that, I remember an article I think I shared with you of seeing where, to another extreme, they were saying if you take like an animal like a cheetah and their microbiome and try to put it in a human, and make them run faster. But yeah, no, I like the Tom Brady. I haven't seen that episode. I'll have to look for that.
It was pretty funny.
Well, with that, we kind of alluding to we're not there yet. But what do you predict the future will look like for warfighters in regards to the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so I think there's some kind of near-term things and then some longer-term things, and I'll start with the near-term. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do in our institute here, and in my group in particular, is to use what we already know about strategies for targeting these beneficial microbes that are already inside of us to promote health, warfighter health and performance. And so we're looking at ways of incorporating these healthy nutrients that I talked about earlier, fiber, polyphenols, into military rations, into dining facilities, encouraging consumption of these foods to build a resilience in the gut microbiota, to improve health by using nutrients that we already know target beneficial microbes. We're also interested in exploring existing probiotics that are on the market. There are some that have some hints of evidence that they may have beneficial effects for military performance, cognitive and physical performance. Most of that evidence is from animal studies. We're interested in taking that evidence from the animal into the warfighter. So doing the research that bridges that gap, that says, okay, we can see a beneficial effect in an animal. We know that mice are not warfighters. Can we reproduce those effects in warfighters? And then kind of longer term, there's a lot of interest in designing specific microbial communities or specific microbes, and there's different ways to do this. Kind of like, think of it kind of like as designer probiotics. Probiotics that have been created in a way specifically to confer a specific health benefit on the host. And there's a lot of interest in designing these communities and then eventually turning them into things like dietary supplements. That's a lot further, that's further down the line, definitely 10 years plus out, but I think that's where the field is going. We've kind of been stuck, for the past 20, 30 years in terms of the probiotic space on certain types of bacteria. People are now looking at different types of bacteria that we haven't considered before and designing those communities and those bacteria in a way that can provide either greater health benefits or different health benefits than the probiotics that are currently on the market.
Nice. So a lot to kind of look forward to moving forward. So that's exciting. Do you have any recommendations? I know we listed the one kind of the International Society with the probiotics, but do you have any recommendations in terms of books or videos where people can go and learn more about the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so I think that website is a good one to go to, especially when it comes to probiotics, prebiotics, fermented foods, things like that. I haven't read too much of the kind of lay literature in the field, but there is a good book that I have read. It's a little bit outdated now, but it's called, let me just remind myself, it's called The Good Gut. And it's written by two scientists that are out of Stanford, Justin and Erica Sonnenberg. And I thought that was a good, fair take on the microbiome, at least what we knew about 5 years ago when the book was written. The thing to know is that this field is evolving so much that, even things written 5 years ago, well, a majority of that will still be true. There's so much that will have changed in the meantime. And then there's also a free online course that I've looked at that I thought was well done. Again, it's a little bit outdated, but it's available through Coursera, and I think it's called Gut Check. It's organized by a scientist named Rob Knight, who is kind of the one of the leaders in the field, and it does a nice job of giving an overview of the microbiome, how we study it, and some of the health effects linked to the gut microbiome. So I guess those are kind of the three places I would start with.
No, that's great. And I'll put all those in the links for the folks listening so you can find those and learn more. Is there anything else to share with the audience, or can folks, find you or get in touch with you anywhere?
Yeah, I'm always happy to chat with people, to answer emails. So you can post my email address, and I'm more than happy to take questions. I always get excited about talking about the microbiome because I think there's so much potential there. I think, as I was talking about before, we need to manage our expectations and not get too far ahead of ourselves. You'll see a lot of articles in the popular press, a lot of news on the microbiome these days. And a lot of that's very preliminary. It doesn't always come across that way, but it is very preliminary. However, it's also very exciting. And there's a lot of potential in the field. So I encourage, people to, stick with it and kind of wait it out and see where it goes, because there's unlimited opportunities. And when we think about it from a nutritional perspective is, aside from antibiotics, we know that what we eat is one of the major factors influencing the community of microbes within us. And that community has so many effects on our overall health. So in eating the right types of foods, eating, it sounds lame, I know it does, but fruits, vegetables, whole grains, those types of foods really nourish these beneficial microbes within us. And that can have so many health benefits. So, at the risk of sounding like a boring dietitian that, just spouts off, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, it's really true, especially when it comes to the microbiome. You got to eat those kind of foods.
I'm with you, Phil. Hey, what can you do? It's the science. But no, hey, Phil, thanks so much for being on today. I do want to share with the audience. I had the privilege of working at Usarium for a little bit, and my office was close to Phil's, and I came into that knowing nothing about the microbiome, and not that I know that much now, but I just remember learning from Phil and he got me excited about it to now where, when I see an article come out, I want to read it. I want to see what's going on about that field. I'm always asking him questions, reaching out to him because it is so exciting. And Phil, your passion comes through on this topic. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you for all the, the hard work I know you're doing research wise that benefits the warfighter. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to everybody for listening. Hopefully, we've stimulated some level of interest, and I encourage you to keep thinking on the microbiome, and like I said, reach out and do some research on your own. And it's a fascinating area. One that I never thought I would get into, but one that I'm glad I have, just because it's so fascinating, and you can learn so much.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for being on. And with that, we will wrap up this episode. So until next time.